Hey everyone, and welcome to another discussion on the Rational National. I'm joined now by Heidi Matthews, Assistant Professor of Law at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. Heidi, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I had you on because I read this piece that you wrote for Psyche titled "Talk of Toxic Masculinity Puts the Blame in All the Wrong Places," and this is an issue that to be honest, I haven't really thought all that much of, but everything I hear about toxic masculinity, it really, I mean, the way you frame it, the way you put a different lens on it, I think adds a lot to the discussion, and I can't wait to get into it. But before we even get to your perspective on this, just, I guess for, viewers coming into this issue, how would you describe toxic masculinity, or how is it described normally, and also discuss maybe some of the solutions that are usually presented to toxic masculinity?
Yeah, so this is an important question because I think there's a certain sort of like common sense, mostly online, but also very heavily in the like liberal feminist or like pop feminist, as I refer to it in the peace world, but also now in the parenting world side of things, which I would refer to as basically the like popular discourse around toxic masculinity.
Mhm.
And that's really what I'm talking about in the piece. And I think that's different from toxic masculinity as it's been discussed sort of in the academic literature, right? So there
Mhm.
is like a burgeoning field that's critical in a good way around toxic masculinity itself, but from a more sort of scholarly or more adroitly scholarly position, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then there's what we might understand as like hegemonic masculinity or traditional masculinity ideology. It's sometimes referred to as well. And so, which may or may not fall into the sort of toxic masculinity camp. I mean, part of what I wanted to do with the piece that we're talking about today was to sort of flag for folks that actually the universe that we refer to as toxic masculinity is becoming like really ill-defined, fuzzy at the edges, and overly capacious in I think dangerous ways. And so, if you're in the online sphere at all, whether that's on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, it's very there's just tons like of stuff about where folks are just like signaling or red flagging interventions as toxically masculine in some way. And what's interesting partly to me is the way in which that's become a common sense. So we're supposed to already understand what someone means when they like quote tweet something and say, oh, this is an example of toxic masculinity, or
Yeah.
basically when it's used as a derogative, we're sort of assumed to understand what it means. So I'm glad you start with that question because it's a totally, you know, ill-defined and open and an open category
Mhm.
that has come to encapsulate like everything from actual violence, right? So mass school shootings to like catcalling on the street, right? And
Yeah.
somehow all of it is within this realm of toxic masculinity. In the piece itself, I actually used the APA, so the American Psychological Association's guidelines for practice with men and boys to sort of pin down exactly some of the reference points that I was talking about. And so, just for folks who maybe aren't necessarily familiar with that document or haven't read my piece yet, some of the characteristics that get associated with toxic masculinity, and I'm quoting now, are anti-femininity, achievement, eschewal of the appearance of weakness, and adventure, risk, and violence. And so that's kind of a typical listing of supposedly negative and toxic traits. And, immediately when we look at that sentence and that list, anti femininity sounds bad and problematic, but like risk and adventure sound fun.
Yeah.
so, so, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, as a new father, and my audience knows I have a 6 month old, and you're also a parent. You have twins. This is an issue that I think about as a parent because we want to raise them as somebody who is obviously respectful, considerate to others, but at the same time, I don't want to. I want to ensure that he also has fun and takes risks, and you know what I mean. Like, it still lives a life. So that I guess how does pop culture tend to look at toxic masculinity in terms of the solutions? Like what are presented as the ways to deal with somebody who, I guess, I don't know, a young boy who is shows traits of being anti feminist or whatever. Like, what is the usual approach that we are supposed to take to this issue when, I guess, raising children?
Yeah, so in the parenting sphere, and so it's really I, I wasn't surprised, but I'm continually fascinated by the way these actually really thoroughly political questions about gender and gender performance end up getting litigated and played out around questions of child rearing and also schooling. And so this is something, just a shout out to my friend and colleague, Lisa Kelly at Queen's University, works a lot on, right? So it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, the way that all kinds of things, like just from like race relations, right? uh, uh, Being a great example of the way in which the focus on the child, right, as a sort of the vector for all of our political ambitions, how that plays out. And so that's the same with toxic masculinity. And partly the piece almost reads as a parenting piece because it starts drawing on my own personal experience with having now 1-year-old twins. One's a boy, one's a girl. So it's this funny, like almost science experiment
Yeah.
every day with these kids, and sort of like watching them, and despite like all of my better angels and rationality or whatever, I find myself like asking, like, is there something I need to be concerned about with the boy, especially vis-a-vis his interactions with the girl, right?
Hmm.
So it's super fascinating. It was just like really puzzling to me. Um but to answer your question, the first avenue of like redress, right, is in the sphere of parenting.
Hmm.
So I don't know if you spend any time on like parenting Instagram or whatever. I got kind of,
Occasionally, yeah.
yeah, like maybe, I mean, that might be a gendered thing as well. I got
Hmm.
like perversely interested in pop culture around first pregnancy, right? So when I was pregnant, I was like obsessed with the kind of performances on Instagram around pregnancy, and now I'm finding like the child rearing aspect of that super interesting. But it's exactly this: the intervention is meant to start early on, right? So we're meant to start, according to pop culture, right, and the discourse, the popular discourse of toxic masculinity, we're meant to start surveilling the behavior and preoccupations and predispositions, to the extent that there are any, right? According to whatever parent, if you're a blank slate or not. But you're meant to start surveilling what your kids are doing, right? Watching them. For me, watching my son play with my daughter, or watching your kid at the playground, or whatever, and sort of intervening if something looks to be, potentially a sign of like burgeoning toxicity. And then of course that just continues, right? So that plays into schooling. Toxic masculinity is actually made, I mean, now I'm going to sound easily like, the flip here is that one starts sounding like a right winger when you start questioning like school curriculum stuff, but it's important, right? So toxic masculinity is making its way over the past like 2 to 5 years into school curricula, sort
Hmm.
of at all levels, and right. So, and also across jurisdictions. So it's something that you see in the U.S., but it's also in Canada and some other English-speaking jurisdictions as well, where teachers are like doing like workbooks on what healthy masculinity looks like, as
Hmm.
opposed to like unhealthy performances of masculinity. So there's a bunch of other stuff. It finds expression in the way that we roll out like bullying or anti-bullying policies, particularly again in schools. That's something that the piece gets into. But I mean, the basic point is that we're meant to be suspicious, I think, of boys in a way that we're not meant to be suspicious of girls, right? And I want to flag here too, like the way in which all of a sudden liberal progressives are talking about gender in these binary terms, when at the same time, these are the same people that are like, maybe trying to raise like non-binary
Yeah.
children or
Hmm.
whatever. So there's a whole host of like, fabulously fascinating tensions at play here. But but yeah, a lot of this happens uh in the space of child rearing and schooling, and then of course into adulthood as well. And just in like when it comes to like dealing with like actual grown men, uh, the Me Too movement and the way in which we call out certain masculine behavior as toxic as opposed to calling it like something else. But anyway, that's a discussion we can have.
Yeah, I do think. I mean, what you mentioned there, I think there is a role for that, for just being aware of how you're raising your child, of course, being aware of how they interact, and when it comes to how schools teach these various issues, I do think there's a place for that. But also so let's get to your perspective on this now. You really add a different lens that looks at this in more of a systemic way, as opposed to leaving it to, the parents and the teachers to deal with it on an individual level. So get more into how you view toxic masculinity and I guess the potential solutions to that.
So yeah, it's a great question. So the first thing I would say is that we need to take a step back from the perspective of framing, right? So I think part of the problem with the discourse around toxic masculinity is that much of what we so easily today label as problematic, like obviously problematic behavior, maybe is not as problematic as we thought, or is problematic in different ways than we think, right? And then correlatively, it might also not be as male as we think, right? So the ease with which we ascribe gender to really disruptive or destructive or antisocial behavior, I think is too quick, right? So
Yeah.
that's what I would say from the beginning. So I'm not even sure that the problem as it's being posed, I think, is an incorrect sort of framing
Hmm.
of the problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the framing, right? The simplistic framing that certain behavior is obviously bad, it's obviously male, right? Lends itself to a sort of like marketization, individualization, capitalist imperative, if you want to talk about it in that kind of language, right? So marketing correct parenting or good left, liberal, progressive, whatever parenting is like a sellable thing in the same way that marketing sort of Catherine Rottenberg calls it defanged liberal feminism is like an easy thing to do, right? So it's easy to write a whole bunch of articles about like how not to raise a shitty man, and
Yeah.
this starts in childhood or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it's incredible. They're like all over the place, and it's just like in the same way that the Me Too movement is like irresistible clickbait. In other words, like deeply personal stories about shitty men are something that we love to read. I think there's something similar going on there with toxic masculinity as well. And so I'm my thought is one to take a step back from the framing that assumes all that stuff, because I don't think that's sort of descriptively or analytically accurate or helpful. And then politically, from a normative perspective, it's also not helpful as well, right? Because if you're somebody who's a progressive or even further on the left, like myself, you're going to want to be concerned about the structures that create the things that we view as being bad, and then also the sort of more systemic solutions to those problems, right? And so the problem here is not necessarily individual bad parenting or inattentive parenting or individual boys' behavior on the playground, that needs to be disciplined. The problem, to the extent that there is one in this space, is dealing with individuals who are basically unsupported by society in one way or another, and aren't able to be sort of generally socialized in a good and socially and politically productive way, right? So the
Hmm.
problem is probably not so much the masculinity or gender piece of the thing, but the fact that we have families all around us who don't have access to safe, reliable, good childcare, right? Don't have
Hmm.
access to like good education for their kids, who aren't able to form the sort of attachment parenting bonds that the anti-toxic masculinity literature tells us are necessary to give boys a sense of inner security that they need in order not to be later assholes or school shooters or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's like the question is a much more fundamental one about the commitments we as a society have to supporting families, in particular in this like fucking crazy, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear,
Yeah,
sorry,
you can swear.
crazy like pandemic situation that we find ourselves
Yeah.
in, but which is attached, of course, to like very, very severe and deep economic problems. And all of this, as the piece talks about, has, of course, really deep gendered or sorry, racialized component as well, right? So it's not just a class question; it's a question of race and racialization and how those axes intersect, right, as it were.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, I mean, to bring up what you were discussing earlier about how it's so marketable to discuss, how to solve, toxic masculinity through raising a child that, doesn't do this, this, and this. Whereas it's a lot tougher to have the discussion about the systemic issues that lead to people being in a situation where they're more prone to certain toxic behaviors that can be that isn't as easily marketable to discuss that as it is to discuss the toxic masculinity, the term and everything that comes with that. But do you think so? In terms of, I guess, addressing some of that, is it really simply about improving material conditions in people's lives? Is it about a almost just strictly a class issue, or do you still think there's a role for, I guess, in terms of parenting or schooling, or do you think that's already, we have that down and we should now focus on more of the class part of this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, so we don't have anything down.
Yeah.
At least, you know what I mean? So, like, if we need to do everything better, and I don't want to I'm not like a class reductionist or whatever, right, in that sense. So
Yeah.
I think there's a value, as I said, to the way in which these axes of both privilege and oppression intersect and play out in the world, right? So there's a value to that lens. But certainly materiality, I think, is a very, very strong and intentionally overlooked component, right? So what I want to point out is not so much that the behaviors that we call toxic masculinity or toxically masculine. So as I keep mentioning school shooters, it's like something that keeps coming up, right?
Hmm.
Violence in that way is obviously a problem that needs to be dealt with in one way or another, and it may or may not have gendered components, right? There's certainly masculinity studies is important. It needs to continue. It's not something that needs to be like totally backgrounded or overlooked. But the operation that I'm interested in is how when we focus on the gender part of the question, we're being asked to ignore or even just pretend that the sort of material class stuff doesn't exist at all, right?
Yeah.
And so not only are we being sold the individualist atomized gendered
Hmm.
analysis, right? We're being sold a gendered analysis, told that our gender analysis is actually does the kind of macro political work that really a class analysis would do much better, right?
Hmm.
And we're sort of just asked to take off the table a lot of more thorny questions about gender relations, right? And again, in the wake of the Me Too movement, if that's what we want to call it, having really difficult discussions about gender from a political perspective are made more difficult by the kind of move that discourses around toxic masculinity make.
Well, it's an incredible piece. I'll link to it below the video. Talk of toxic masculinity puts the blame in all the wrong places. Where can people find your work online or
Great,
find you
yeah.
online?
So you can Google me, but I'm on Twitter at Heidi underscore underscore Matthews. So yeah, I'm basically always there to
All
be
right.
found.
All right.
Thanks
I'll
so
link
much,
to
Ian.
the link and your Twitter as well below the video. Thanks so much, Heidi, for coming on.
Thank you. Bye.